Gary Leon Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is an American serial killer. He was initially convicted on 48 separate murders. As part of his plea bargain, another conviction was added, bringing the total number of convictions to 49, making him the second most prolific serial killer in United States history. He killed many teenage girls and women in the state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Most of Ridgway's victims were alleged to be sex workers and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including underage runaways. The press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River before his identity was known. He strangled his victims, usually by hand, but sometimes using ligatures. After strangling them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Ridgway is believed to have murdered at least 71 teenage girls and women near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. In court statements, he later reported that he had killed so many that he lost count. A majority of the murders occurred between 1982 and 1984. The victims were believed to be either sex workers or runaways whom he picked up along the Pacific Highway South. Ridgway sometimes showed the woman a picture of his son to trick them into trusting him. They would engage in sexual activity, and after minutes of intercourse from behind, Ridgway would wrap his forearm around the front of the necks and use the other arm to pull back as tightly as he could, strangling them. There were also 2 confirmed and another 2 suspected victims found in the Portland, Oregon area. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes posted, usually nude. He would sometimes return to the victims' bodies and have sexual intercourse with them. Ridgway occasionally contaminated the dump sites with gum, cigarettes, and written materials belonging to others, and he even transported a few victims' remains across state lines to Oregon to confuse the police. In the early 1980s, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders. Force members included Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, who periodically interviewed incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy in 1984. Bundy offered his opinions on the psychology, motivations, and behaviors of their killer. He suggested that the killer was revisiting the dump sites to have sex with his victims, which turned out to be true. And if police found a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait for him to come back. Ridgway was arrested in 1982 and 2001 on charges related to prostitution. He became a suspect in the Green River killings in 1983. In 1984, Ridgway passed a polygraph test. On April 7, 1987, police took hair and saliva samples from Ridgway. The samples collected in 1987 were later subjected to DNA analysis, proving the evidence for his arrest warrant. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he worked as a spray painter, when police arrived to arrest him. Ridgway was arrested on suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years earlier, after first being identified as a potential suspect. DNA evidence conclusively linked semen left in the victims to the saliva swab taken by the police. The forensic scientists identified microscopic spray paint spheres as a specific brand of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the specific time frame when these victims were killed. On November 5th, 2003, Ridgway entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder as part of a plea deal. The deal would spare him execution in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims and providing other details. In a statement accompanying his guilty plea, Ridgway explained that he had killed all of his victims inside King County, Washington, and then he had transported and dumped the remains of 2 women near Portland to confuse the police. On December 18, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer. Over a period of 5 months of police and prosecutor interviews, he confessed to 48 murders, 42 of which were on the police's list of probable Green River killer victims. In his confession, he acknowledged that he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them. He confessed that he had sex with his victims' bodies after he murdered them. Ridgway was placed in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla in January 2004. Before Ridgway's confessions, authorities had attributed 49 murders to the Green River Killer. Ridgway confessed to murdering at least 71 victims.